Hello everyone and welcome to this month's free webinar, and today we're going to be talking about developing and maintaining organisational culture. My name is Danette Fenton-Menzies and I'm the Director of Learning here at Magical Learning. I'm quite excited about this topic because particularly during all this disruption, this is an area which can easily be forgotten. And it is actually something that is really important to concentrate on because it does help people go through all of this disruption and be able to cope with it. And Lil, welcome. I can see that you're online. So lovely to see you. And I would encourage anyone who's online to share questions as we go through this as well. And apologies if it started a little bit late. We had a little bit of technical challenge, which is always the way, isn't it? So what we're going to cover today in this particular webinar is looking at what is actual organisational culture, what are the elements of it, what are the things that actually impact it, and also a couple of strategies to help improve organisational culture. Now, for those of you who are new to Zoom, there is a little toolbar up the top, it's up the top of my screen. If you wiggle your mouse, you'll eventually see a toolbar. And on the far right-hand side, there is 3 buttons with more, and under that, if you click that button, you can get a chat function. So at any time throughout the webinar, feel free to use this to chat to me and ask questions as we go. All right. So I love sayings, and this particular one is from a gentleman called Tony Shea, and Tony Shea runs an organisation called Zappos, and they're world famous for their company culture. So I love this quote of Tony's, which is, if you get the culture right, most of the other stuff will take care of itself. And this is so true. So I want to share a story about the culture of Zappos, just so you can get an idea of what a really great culture looks like, not just in the past, but also what they're doing today to continue great culture. So a story that happened a couple of years ago, they're world famous for their customer service, and Tony Shea talks about really what their organisation stands for is happiness. So there was a husband and wife, they were packing up their house, they were moving to another city in the US, and Zappos is based in the US. Anyway, the husband was going through, I think, his wife's drawers, and he found all of her jewellery, and she had it in a little bag. And he saw a Zappos box, and he assumed that was going to go and be packed. So he put the jewellery in the box. Anyway, they move, they start unpacking, and his wife goes, I can't find my jewellery. And the husband's like, oh, it's in the Zappos box. And she goes, oh no. And he goes, what? And she said, I returned that Zappos box to Zappos before we moved, because one of the things they do is they take their boxes back. So it helps with environmental things. Anyway, panic call from the husband to Zappos. The box had arrived, and the gentleman who'd received it, once he knew that it had something very valuable inside it, he went, you know what? This is too valuable to send back by freight. So the company allows employees to do whatever it takes to provide excellent customer service. So this customer service phone operator used his company credit card, purchased a flight to where the couple had moved, hand delivered the jewellery to make sure that it arrived safely, and then flew back to Las Vegas, which is where Zappos is located. And one of the lovely things about Zappos is that's not an unusual story. So as an organisation, they have really focused on how do they wow their customers. One of the things that they're doing at the moment, which I think is really lovely, is on their webpage, they've actually advertised, if you need to talk, feel free to call one of our customer service operators. They're not timed. They don't have to sell anything. So it actually says, we're not going to sell you anything, but if you need to talk, we're here to listen. And I think that's a beautiful demonstration of a culture through the good times and the bad times, is really clear on what's important for them. Graham and I went to Zappos headquarters, and Tony Shea's desk, he's the CEO, is exactly the same as everyone else's, except it's got lots of fun stuff. He wasn't there on the day we were there, but it's just a workstation like any other person in his organisation. So he's very much that focus on the customer service, and it's by looking after and creating a great culture for the organisation. We'll come back to Zappos because I have some great stories. So I'm interested, is there anything you specifically wanted to learn out of today's webinar? And I know some people are struggling with culture at the moment, so that's definitely an area that people are interested in. Also, what can change in a culture? So what causes culture to change, and what are those key elements? There's some other things that people say to me often, this is what I would like to cover. So in terms of definitions of organisational culture, this one comes from Gotham Culture, and they talk about the underlying beliefs, assumptions, values, and ways of interacting that contribute to the unique social and psychological environment of an organisation. So it is part about work, but it's also about the social connections. It's about the psychological safety, etc., in an organisation. And what you can see with the culture is a culture can be very strong, and within an organisation there can be subcultures depending on who is leading those different areas within an organisation. It's often seen as a little bit difficult because it's a little bit intangible. How do you really create something that is a bit intangible? But as Zappos have showed, they've been going for 20 years last year, so 21 this year, and they've really focused on culture as a differentiator for them, particularly as an employer of choice, so much so that they actually have a culture book. So each year the staff contribute around their values and the culture that's going on, both good and bad. So they are encouraged to be transparent about what's working and also what's not. Now, other cultures might be very opaque, meaning that we don't really talk about what's going on or what's not. And in the worst cases where that happens, we'll see big corporate disasters like Enron and WorldCom and stuff like that. The culture for me is the feel of an organisation. Am I welcomed? What matters to that organisation? What is rewarded in terms of behaviours, etc. So let's look at some of the factors that make up an organisational culture. And I like to think of a culture as, when they talk about, and if I go back a slide for a second, when they talk about the beliefs, the assumptions, the values and interaction, it's like peeling back the layers of an onion to find, who are we and what makes us different from an organisation that offers the same services or products. Why do people choose to work with us, supply us, be our customers, etc.? And part of that is the culture. So there's an organisation called Hofstede, and it was created around a gentleman called Professor Hofstede, who did a lot and still does a lot in terms of organisational culture and the research around it. And he talks about there are 6 main factors of organisational culture that sort of are like levers. So if we change, say, the lever under organisational effectiveness, we move it up or down one way or the other, that's going to give us a slightly unique culture compared to someone else in our industry. So he sort of pulled apart what were the 6 key factors that really make up organisational behaviour. So the first one, organisational effectiveness. Organisations either concentrate on means or goals, or they're somewhere between those two. And when we talk about means, the people identify with how the organisation goes about doing things. Whereas when we talk about the goals, the people are much more focused on the what. Now, some organisations in terms of customer orientation are much more internal. So they really focus internally. They believe they know what the customer wants. Ethics and things like honesty really matter in organisations that are internally customer focused. Where the customer orientation is more external, which is the other end of that lever, then the organisation is much more pragmatic. They're about giving the customer what they want, and that sometimes can lead to some interesting ethics. Not always, but it is certainly something to keep in mind. Level of control is another one of those factors. And at one end of the scale, you've got an organisation that is about easygoing work. So, you know, people are allowed to bring their life into the world, their workplace. The workplace get that. It's relaxed. They trust their employees, etc. On the other end of that scale, around level of control, we have organisations that are very much more strict. So there are rules, there are people watching people, etc. And, you know, some organisations, particularly during this disruption, will have, if they were at the more, strict end of that spectrum, would have struggled in terms of people working from home, where there wasn't that high trust and there was that need for control. And that obviously disrupts a culture when that happens, when something outside of the organisation's control happens, and all of a sudden it's, you know, people working from home and perhaps leaders not being used to trusting their people as much as they should have. The fourth element here is focus. So is it more local? And by local, in the workplace, I identify with my work unit and my boss. So I come to work because of what I do with them. When it's more the opposite end of that spectrum, they talk about professional. So when the focus is more on professional, it's really, my identity is determined by the profession that I belong to or the content of my job. So for me, I'm an accountant by trade. If I was working in a finance area of an organisation, if I was more on the professional, I'd relate to the professional side versus whatever my area did. The fifth element is approachability, and approachability is about if I join this organisation, am I going to feel like I'm welcomed? So it doesn't matter who I am. It is an environment, a culture that is welcoming to outsiders as well as insiders. Now, the opposite of approachability and the open system approach is the closed system. So basically, it doesn't matter how long you are at the organisation. If you're recently new and you've been there for a while, but you weren't part of the initial in-group, you're probably going to feel like you're excluded. And again, this creates part of a culture, doesn't it? And the last bit is the management philosophy. So is the organisation more employee orientated, or is it more task orientated? And again, this creates part of the feeling. So if you walk into an organisation that is more employee focused, there'll be often a lot more social interaction, chit chat, etc. In the old days when we had offices and stuff, you'd see photos of families and stuff like that. Whereas a more task orientated meetings would start with, okay, let's begin. No, how was your weekend, or anything like that. And again, it just makes up the culture of the organisation. So why are these important? Well, obviously, as we change the levers on these, it changes how culture shows up in an organisation. And culture is really important. For example, there was a study that showed that 46% of job seekers cite companies' culture as very important as to whether they would take a job or apply for a particular company. So people will often talk to past employees, and they'll get a sense of, is this an organisation that I would want to work for or not? And organisations that don't have that employee focus, they'll often lose good employees who will, if they've not done a good debrief and found out what can we change and make better, some employees will go away and just tell everyone what a horrid organisation it is. And so that lessens the amount of people that are likely to apply to the organisation. So culture is one of those things that really is important, and certainly when we're looking to get access to the best employees and also the best customers, etc. You know, happy employees create happy customers. Richard Branson's quote, "There's no magical formula for great company culture." My mouth's working really well today. The key is just treat your staff how you would like to be treated. And if you look at the Virgin brand, it's a fun brand, etc. And that's very much based on Richard Branson's culture, and they've deliberately gone to set that up in their organisation. So let's talk about the first strategy that I think is really important in terms of if we want to create a good culture. And the first one is our management practices, particularly during all of this disruption. We need to look at which management practices are empowering our employees, making them feel good, and which ones perhaps are no longer suitable. So what we know from the latest research is that a lot of employees like some flexibility. Now, when a lot of organisations had to send staff home and work from home, while people might have said before that, oh, I'd like some flexibility to work from home, when you're told you have to work from home, that's not really flexibility. It's just, and that can be disruptive for many people. So flexibility is when we are able to, because obviously there are COVID restrictions at the moment, when we're able to, having those discussions with our employees about what work looks like in terms of flexibility for them, and seeing how we can work that into how our workplace operates. For example, in our company, we have a number of part-time employees. Now, we don't set their hours. They work out when they do those hours. We're not focused on them doing a timesheet or anything. It's really about what they produce. And so they love that, because maybe they want to go to the markets or something on a particular day. They don't have to say, is it okay to have today off? They know they just manage their workload and their hours themselves. So being employee focused is really important in terms of our management practices. There's a whole stack of brain science around. One of the things we get from a good workplace is a sense of belonging. And when we don't have that sense of belonging, we don't get as much in terms of people's brain power. So the moment a person doesn't feel like they're belonging, their brain gets stimulated in the threat part of the brain. So this is on the side of your brain. And so it becomes each person for themselves. What we want to create is a really nice, inclusive culture, so that everyone feels like there's trust, there's transparency, and that they're valued. Now, when we do that, we get the best out of our people. So as a manager or a leader, my practices really should be focused much more now on mentoring and coaching rather than directing, which is more the old approach. Leaders should be taking time to connect with their people around what is the purpose of our organisation, what's the purpose of the work we're doing. They should be celebrating the accomplishments, because we know when we celebrate, that has a lot of positive impacts. And just really connecting to the person as an individual. Because again, when we feel like we matter to a person and an organisation, we're going to give a lot more than when we don't feel like we matter. The benefits of those more inclusive coaching, mentoring, you get to know your people, and plus it builds trust. And trust is one of those things that is so important if we want to have a high-performing organisation. Now, another interesting stat that I'd love to share with you is that 86% of potential employees would not apply or continue to work for a company that has a bad reputation with their former employees. So again, it's not just looking after your employees while they're there, it's also thinking about how do we, look after those that have left. And a lot of smart organisations have alumni of previous employees, and what they want to do is keep that engagement, so that those alumni can recommend the organisation to potential employees. And where they work really well, they get great outcomes. Obviously, where they don't work well and where the organisation hasn't looked after their former employees, yeah, you know what's going to happen. It's not going to be pretty. So that's the first strategy that I would recommend. The second one is really important, and I'm going to share the stats with you on this one. So one of the things that we're seeing a lot more of at the moment, again because of the disruption, is that staff are more stressed, they're more inclined to be moving towards burnout. Holding one-on-ones with your staff, so connecting as a manager or a leader with your staff, has an amazing impacts from a mental health perspective. So we know that if you meet with an employee one-on-one once a month, it reduces the likelihood of burnout by 39%, so nearly 40%. But wait for this, if we increase those one-on-ones to once a fortnight, and they don't have to be long, so 15, 20, 30 minutes, what we see is a reduction of 84% in the likelihood of burnout. And again, because what it does is it creates connection. It allows the employee to share what's going on, what's working, what's not working. And because of that connection, we're far more likely to get the honesty, etc. Being able to share with people also helps just reduce their stress, because it's like if I've got a problem and I share it, then I've sort of halved that problem. If I keep it to myself, and I've not got any release from that, then it gets heavier and heavier. So some things to do to make sure that one-on-ones work really well is make sure that you schedule and track them, so that you are actually ticking them off and making sure that they're done. Equip yourself with some talking points, and it can be just some questions that you might want to ask your employee. For example, what is one thing I could do to change that would make your work easier? Simple way for you to find out whether you're doing something that might be triggering stress in the employees. The other thing is just that recognition of what they're doing well. And if something's not quite working, having that conversation in a space where the person knows you've got their back, because it's a continuous space. It's not about blame. We know in cultures that are not particularly great, there's a much greater focus on criticism. And because they're not great cultures, there's often a lot of blame as well. What we see where we create a really good culture is I can have a difficult conversation with one of my staff because it's saying, hey, I've just noticed this isn't quite working. Let's talk about what we could do different. Now, because we're talking regularly, because we're also focused on celebrating what's being done, etc., they're not always hearing what's not working. That's only a slight part of the conversation. What we tend to see where one-on-ones happen frequently is people are far less stressed. So that means they're more relaxed. We're going to get more of their brain because they're not going to be sitting in the threat response. They're going to have the blood flow in the thinking part of their brain. And trust really is so important. So a couple of years ago, 2012, I think it was, Google did a project trying to identify what creates high-performing teams. And this particular project was called Project Aristotle. And what they discovered was the number one thing that makes a great high-performing team is not the members of the team, but a thing called psychological safety. And psychological safety has two elements. And really those elements are, one, that everyone in the team has equal airtime. So throughout the day, throughout meetings, etc., everyone's voice is heard. Now, the reason that's important is because what it says is no matter what I'm thinking, the group is interested in my contribution. And this is where we see teams go from perhaps having diversity to actually creating what we call inclusion, because inclusion is where, doesn't matter what I look like, sound like, etc., people are interested in what I've got to say. So it's really important because it creates that sense of inclusion, which creates psychological safety. The other thing around it is what we call social sensitivity. And this is where before meetings and at the beginning of the day and at check-in, etc., before we get into the task, we have a little bit of a social check-in. So, I can see Evelyn and Lil here, so, we might be having a meeting and I'm just like, how are you both going? What's going on for you? And just those simple, quick check-ins before the start of a meeting really just create that psychological safety, because what it says is the leader cares about the people, not just as workers, but as individuals as well. So what we see with the one-on-ones is they do help create that psychological safety. Another thing is, as a boss, sometimes it can be really, we're a bit stressed, don't have a lot of time. It is also empowering the team to create peer on peer so that they connect as peers and also, celebrate what they've accomplished and talk about ways of improving things moving forward. So that pressure doesn't all have to sit with the leader. We can also encourage our team members to connect with one another, again, because that creates that sense of connection, reduces stress and increases trust, which creates a really nice corporate culture. Now, another thing that is really important is focus on what is important. So again, one of the reasons we're running this at the moment is because it is really easy to become quite short-term focused. And short-term, for some organisations, is how do we survive? For other organisations, just how do we get all this stuff done in really fast amount of time? That can lead sometimes, and I acknowledge that if an organisation is struggling financially, they really do need to get their finances organised first. What they do need to be also thinking about is how do we make sure that we are here for the long term as well. So they keep that long-term focus on the culture. Because I know from teaching a lot of ethics and also looking and examining a lot of corporate failures is that the moment we take our eyes off, and I apologise, I must have left my emails on, so it's blipping. I do apologise. Tech. So with a corporate disaster, most of them have started with that short-term profit focus and just making excuses about, oh yeah, the values say that, but we're going to do this in this instance. So I think, and I've certainly seen this with great organisations, and that example from Zappos earlier about their call centre staff being, instructed, look, if anyone rings up and just needs to talk, that's absolutely perfectly part of who we are. You don't need to sell anything, is a really good example of an organisation that's going, yes, there's lots of disruption for us like every other organisation, but we're about happiness and we're about customer wow. So how do we keep our people focused on that? Not just long term, but right now. What can we do to make a difference? There was an organisation, because what I also love about Zappos is they share ideas that organisations can do through disruption to make their organisations better. And another organisation they spoke about was an organisation called the Vox Agency. And from what I understand, they're like a marketing advertising agency. And one of the things that they stood for and are still not-for-profit during disruption is that any of their not-for-profit clients, or in fact any not-for-profit client, just not-for-profit that's struggling through disruption and needs a little bit of help around marketing, they will do pro bono work to support those not-for-profits. So again, they're saying we're about helping our community. That's part of our culture. So let's do that right now too. And I do apologise for my email. I'm so sorry. So in terms of what else do we focus on that's important right now to continue to create that great culture, it's what's our strategy about? How do we connect our people with that strategy so we're all on the same page? Focusing on the outcomes rather than the hours that people are working. There'll be a number of people in Melbourne at the moment that are in lockdown. I've got clients whose children are at home as well, so they're juggling, childcare, schooling, as well as work, as well as having their partner at home too, or maybe not having a partner, so having to juggle that by themselves. So if we we are an organisation where work is between 9 to 5 for argument's sake, and I've worked for organisations like that, and we don't want to know about what's going on in your life, that's going to be really difficult for people to manage at the moment, and that will increase their stress. So how can we take that focus away from you must be on from this time to this time, where it's possible, and focus more on, okay, how can we help you achieve what you need in terms of the outcomes we're after? We need as organisations to acknowledge that part of the corporate culture does change when we work from home. We need to be a bit more flexible. We need to be understanding if a kid or a partner comes and interrupts during a meeting. I was on a meeting the other day and one of the kids came in because it was bedtime. This was a course I'm doing. Kid came in and hugged mum. And we're all like, oh, isn't that beautiful? And that's the new reality. Sometimes the kids will need a hug, or they'll need a little bit of parent time. Sometimes the other partner might need a help. There's also obviously people with elderly parents that they'll be concerned about, etc. So it is taking that time to really focus on how do we support our people through this disruption. And if I look at the leadership qualities that I think are really important at the moment, compassion is absolutely one of them. So in our culture, how do we help our leaders be more compassionate? How do we help our team members also be more compassionate? I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and she's doing some work in an organisation where the culture is particularly not good at the moment. And she was saying there was a meeting and a couple of people had called in rather than being face-to-face. So they weren't in Melbourne, they were in another environment where people could be in the workplace. A couple of people were just really stressed with what was going on. And so they were dialing in. And people who were actually in the room were doing behaviour which for me is not appropriate behaviour. So they were sticking their fingers up at the people on the screen, and they were doing but with a really sarcastic look on their face. Now that's really horrible. That says we're not a team together. That's not a focus. So that's why compassion is really important. I also think that candor, so being honest with your people about what we know and also what we don't know. If things aren't 100%, if we let our people know, look, this is what I know, this is what we're doing towards this, our people are more likely to trust us than us just looking stressed and keeping those things to ourselves. Now, obviously, when we share it with our people, we need to be calm. If we're like, oh, it's a disaster, we're going to freak everyone out. But if we say, look, we've got a couple of challenges, these are what they are and we're working on them, but also we'd love to know any ideas you've got as well. We feel, again, more connected and more included. The other thing we still need to be doing is action, because when we see action, it creates momentum. And sometimes we'll make a decision and it won't be right. The faster we admit, hey, it wasn't the right decision, say to your people, hey, I thought it was the right way ahead, it clearly didn't work, open to suggestions, and we work out the new way forward and start that action, we just get that beautiful momentum. Now, another thing that we know we see, and this is my bonus suggestion in terms of creating good cultures, is celebrate. The moment we celebrate the little actions, we all feel connected. Our body releases the beautiful feel-good chemicals, so serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, and they basically connect us and make us want to take more action. So in our team, we do the party dance. And anyone who knows me knows we do the party dance. Now, the moment I do it, my team laugh, they do it as well. And all of us at the end of it are smiling. And we want to do more because we want to celebrate more. That is much better than the old approach, which was, oh, we did 5 things great, 1 thing miserable. So we focus on the one miserable thing or the one thing that didn't quite get done. That's the old approach to goal setting, which we now know doesn't work. Have you ever made a New Year's resolution, perhaps to lose weight or exercise more, and a couple of days in you've just, no, stopped doing it? Part of the reason we now know that is we don't celebrate it. We tend to, when we stop doing it, beat ourselves up. In fact, what we know is the moment we start celebrating, dopamine is released, and dopamine is the action chemical. And so it makes us want to do it again. And we see this on social media. So a person gets a like, pretend this is my phone, they want more because they get a hit of dopamine. Thank you, Lil. I'm so glad you're still on the party dance. It's beautiful. So that celebration just brings us together again as a team. And, you know, with little steps, they add up over time. So if I improve 1%, I take 1% more action today, over time, it creates big change. And my own story, when lockdown happened, I realised that I needed a bit more upper body strength. So I set, before I would hop in the shower in the morning, I had to do, or I said to myself, I would like to do 15 push-ups. And once I reach 15, I can celebrate. Very quickly, I got up to 100 push-ups. Now, these are on the bathroom basement. I'm not down on the floor, but actually on the basin. But now, every day, I do 100 push-ups. And then straight after, I'm like, party, party. And that's kept me wanting to do it. Even on morning through, I'm really tired. I'm like, no, you only have to do 15 and then you can celebrate. But I always get now to 100. So that's the power of celebrating. And in your team, celebrate what we want them to do. Don't focus on the things we don't want them to do. Obviously, if they're behaviours that are inappropriate, have that conversation. But as much as possible, reward the behaviours that we want to continue in our culture. So corporate cultures matter. How management chooses to treat its people impacts everything, for better or for worse. And I really like Simon Sinek's work. If you've not seen any of his TED Talks, I would highly recommend them. He has really great insights around creating great cultures. So I'm curious, is there something you're going to take away and do more of, or perhaps stop doing after today's webinar? Please feel free to put in the chat box. Now, one of the things I will send out, so you'll get a copy of this recording after, obviously, we finished the webinar. We'll also send out a link. Yesterday, we published an article in relation to things to think about during disruption for organisational culture. So you'll get a copy of that as well. We've also got a number of helpful resources here to get you to think about culture. I quite like this book by Daniel Coyle, The Culture Code, really good insights around creating great cultures. Now, the other thing is next month, our theme for the month is going to be on goal setting and delegation. So our webinar next month will be on the 16th of September, same time, 10:30 Australian Eastern Standard Times. I will also point out that one of the new features we've introduced, because we do love to look after our community, is that one afternoon a month, both Graham and I will be available just to chat to people if they're sort of challenged, or maybe they've want some strategies about whatever to help them move forward. That is actually happening this afternoon. We have that information on our website, magicallearning.com, or if you just want to email me, and I'll put my email in the chat box, I'm happy to also send you that link. Feel free to share it with anyone. If you or those you know that would benefit from this can't make today, because we only started it this month, just email me and we will find a time to slot in and just chat to people. So it's just, just having someone you can talk to in safety, I suppose, and someone who can give you some other strategies to help you move forward. So every month we have a theme, and this month's theme is obviously organisational culture, because we always base our webinar on what the theme is for the month. So we're sharing a lot of resources on our social media around that. Feel free to join us. We also do a podcast, and what else was I going to tell you? Oh, we have a newsletter once a month too that has helpful resources too. So if there are any other ways we can serve you, please feel free to reach out to us. So I appreciate you giving us your time this morning, and I look forward to talking to you either during this month or on next month's webinar. So until then, take care and have a magical month. All right. Thank you so much, everyone.